Pamphylian is a little attested and isolated dialect of ancient Greek which was spoken in Pamphylia, on the southern coast of Asia Minor. Its origins and relation to other Greek dialects are uncertain. A number of scholars have distinguished in Pamphylian dialect important isoglosses with Arcado-Cypriot which allow them to be studied together. Pamphylia means land of all files. The Achaeans may have settled the region while under the leadership of Amphilochus, Chalchus, and Mopsus. However, other cities in Pamphylia were established by different Greek tribes. Aspendos was a colony of Argos, Side was a colony of Aeolian Cyme, Silion was a colony of an unknown Greek mother city, and Perga was a colony established by a wave of Greeks from northern Anatolia. The isolation of the dialect took place even before the appearance of the Greek article. Pamphylian is the only dialect that does not use articles with the exception of Mycenaean and poetic language. Glossary. Beta epsilon lambda iota alpha kappa omicron nu, abeliacon, solar. Beta omega beta alpha sigma, arbo bash, adonis. Gamma epsilon theta lambda alpha, Agathla, sacrificial victims. Gamma omicron sigma, agos, priest. Delta rho iota, Adri the man. Eta delta omega nu, Eden or beta eta delta omega nu, Abaddon, Athena. Alpha beta epsilon tau omicron sigma, Ibetus, eagle. Mu epsilon iota nu alpha sigma iota sigma, Ammonasis, Mentha. Pi epsilon lambda omicron nu, Apollon. Rho kappa epsilon mu alpha, Archimar, locust. Tau rho omega pi omicron iota sigma iota, atropoisa or tau rho omicron pi omicron iota sigma iota dative, plural. Beta alpha beta epsilon lambda iota omicron sigma, Babelios, sun. Beta omicron alpha, boa, oxen, cattle. Beta omicron lambda epsilon mu epsilon sigma, Bolninus, willing. Beta omicron epsilon rho iota kappa epsilon pi alpha rho iota sigma omicron sigma, Ori Cuperissos, vineyard. Epsilon sigma tau epsilon delta iota epsilon sigma, Espuedius, Aspendios or Aspendian. Epsilon tau iota alpha, wet years. Iota lambda sigma, Wilsis, distress. Kappa tau iota sigma, Icties, weasel, skunk, cat or member of Felidae. Omicron delta epsilon, iodu, imp, they should go. Kappa alpha sigma epsilon alpha sigma, Caswage, Thunus. Kappa alpha tau epsilon Roshi omicron delta epsilon, Cageworksida. Kappa omicron rho alpha sigma, Corcoras, bird or rooster. Kappa omicron rho tau alpha phi omicron sigma, Cortiphos, temple. Lambda alpha phi nu eta, Daphne. Lambda alpha psi alpha, Lapsa, turnip. Nu iota, Ni, in or one. Rho omicron epsilon beta omega, or albo, rush forward. Pi epsilon delta epsilon, Pede, 5. Pi epsilon rho tau epsilon delta omicron kappa epsilon, Pertidoke, he gave. Pi eta rho iota alpha, Pairia, field or farm. Sigma alpha rho alpha pi iota omicron iota, Sarapi omicron I, small fish, Picel, or Menadae. Sigma iota lambda alpha rho omicron sigma, Scyllaris, partridge. Sigma kappa epsilon delta rho, Scudru. Tau rho iota mu iota sigma kappa omicron nu, Trimascon, clothing. Lambda omicron gamma omicron sigma, Hologos, army. V alpha nu alpha pi rho epsilon iota alpha, Vanessa Priya, lady goddess. V omicron kappa epsilon, Boiku, house. V rho epsilon mu alpha lambda iota alpha, Vramalia. Phi alpha beta omicron sigma, Fabos, light. Phi epsilon mu nu iota omicron nu, Fenian. Phi iota kappa alpha tau iota, Fakati, 20. Onomasticon source. Brick dialect Grec de Pamphyli theta iota mu upsilon sigma athi mu wusan theta iota mu epsilon v sigma pi epsilon lambda alpha v rho upsilon v iota sigma a plavruvis rho tau iota mu iota nu alpha artimina rho tau iota mu iota delta omega rho upsilon sigma artimidorus phi alpha sigma tau upsilon sigma aphasetus phi omicron rho delta iota sigma iota iota upsilon sigma aphrodisius beta alpha lambda upsilon sigma ballas beta omicron beta sigma bobash beta omicron beta tau upsilon sigma gamma omicron upsilon kappa alpha lambda iota sigma gokalize delta epsilon chi iota upsilon sigma dexius delta iota beta tau upsilon sigma dibotis delta iota delta omega rho upsilon sigma diwidoris delta iota also in Cypriot names delta iota omicron nu omicron upsilon sigma iota upsilon sigma dionysius lambda omicron theta epsilon mu iota sigma elothermus epsilon sigma tau lambda epsilon gamma iota upsilon sigma eselgius epsilon chi alpha lambda iota alpha equalia zeta omicron alpha mu upsilon sigma zoemus zeta omega epsilon iota tau omicron upsilon sigma zovitis alpha nu alpha chi alpha delta rho upsilon sigma wana hadrus wanix plus anna alpha o nu omicron pi alpha warnopa alpha o nu iota tau omicron upsilon sigma warnatus epsilon chi iota delta alpha mu upsilon sigma wechadamis epsilon chi iota tau omicron upsilon sigma wechatus omicron upsilon kappa omega wuko theta alpha nu alpha delta omega rho upsilon sigma thanadoris kappa epsilon delta alpha iota sigma kediwiz kappa epsilon sigma keskus kappa epsilon sigma kappa omicron upsilon sigma keskuaus kappa omicron pi epsilon rho iota nu alpha coprina kappa omicron rho alpha lambda iota nu alpha corwalina little girl kappa omicron rho alpha gamma upsilon sigma corrigus sigma pi epsilon delta iota upsilon sigma aspedius aspendian kappa omicron upsilon rho alpha sigma iota co-eurasia kappa upsilon delta rho omicron mu omicron lambda iota sigma kudromolis lambda alpha upsilon delta iota kappa alpha laudica mu iota alpha lambda iota nu alpha myelina or myelina mu omicron upsilon rho iota chi omicron upsilon sigma murixus mu omicron upsilon rho mu alpha kappa omega mormico nu epsilon omicron chi alpha rho iota sigma nu archerish rho upsilon mu nu iota upsilon sigma oromnius pi epsilon delta tau omicron sigma ped datos pi epsilon lambda alpha upsilon rho upsilon iota sigma peloruis pi epsilon rho iota epsilon rho gamma upsilon sigma periwergus pi omicron nu alpha mu epsilon lambda delta sigma ponomeldos pi omicron rho sigma omicron pi alpha porsopa pi rho upsilon sigma prewus sigma alpha rho delta iota alpha sigma swardias and iota sigma alpha rho delta iota alpha sigma v alpha nu alpha chi iota omega nu upsilon sigma vanictionus phi omicron rho delta iota sigma iota alpha fordisia chi omicron rho epsilon iota nu alpha coriana